Right now, we are going to rebroadcast an interview that we did with Max du Preez. He is a columnist, well-known columnist and author, talking about racism in South Africa. Are we winning the battle? You talk about the need for white South Africans to resist the temptation to make racist remarks when they are faced with what they perceive as black racism. Do you think that there's still a lot of that going on in South Africa, where both sides are feeling very much that they're the victims of change in this country?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's a very unfortunate phenomenon where white people, when they hear someone like Julius Malema or Jimmy Manyi making strong statements, whites are criminals or whatever they say, then white people think it suddenly gives them license to be racist. And I'm warning against that. Firstly, because I believe racism, all forms of racism, are fundamentally wrong and fundamentally dangerous in a society like ours. But there's a second reason also, and that is it is stupid of white people, if they feel a threatened minority, to insult the majority and make things worse for themselves.
You talk about this being bad strategy, making things worse for themselves, confirming the beliefs that led to the to the insults in the first place, or the racism in the first place. Why do you feel a need to talk jointly to white South Africans? Did you identify a gap? Did you think nobody's talking to white South Africans, and as a result things are getting from bad to worse? Or is there a feeling that there's no building of bridges between blacks and whites, and therefore there's a need for a strong white voice to come out and say, look, this is where we are, let's continue in this particular route? Yeah,
well, let me say that I have spent my whole adult life primarily fighting against racism.
Mm-hmm.
I come from a rural Afrikaner nationalist home, so racism was something that I grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately for me, as a young man, a young journalist, I saw other sides of the truth in our society and came under the deep impression of how hurtful this is. And sometimes white people don't even think they're racist, and they are perceived as racist. And they hurt people very deeply. And I don't think we can warn against it enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is important, I make the point, that we, lighter-skinned South Africans, should not wait for other people to point out our racism or racism in the ranks of white South Africans. White South Africans who love this country, who are not racists, should jump on racists first. We should look at white people, fellow white people, and warn against racism. And that's what I'm trying to do. Not only the obvious racism, because, there's obvious racism everywhere, and people know when they're racist. I'm talking about this kind of thing of for instance, Julius Malema comes and insults white people. Then some white people go and mock him because of his bad education.
Mm-hmm.
Or they mock him because of his African accent. And that is deeply offensive, and it's deeply racist. They even, when they criticize the president of this country, which is their right to do, I do it myself. I'm not very impressed with our president always.
Mm-hmm.
But he is not a bad president if he is because he is black, or because he has no education, or because he has several wives. And that's what white people go for.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's the kind that they feel they can hurt with those kind of things. And it shows disrespect to culture. If they criticized the president or the government as citizens of this country, as Democrats, then that's just fine. The minute they get into their white skins and they point fingers and they say, well, our bloody president doesn't even have matric, then I say to them, well, look into your own heart and say, why does he not? Why does he not have matric?
Mm-hmm.
What was the system that you and your father and your grandfather perpetuated that denied an obviously highly intelligent man a proper education? And those are the things that I really think we can't say enough. We can't warn against enough.
How do you respond, Max, to those who say, oh gosh, this apartheid again? I mean, people talk about the legacy of apartheid. It's gone, it's past, let's move on. You know, our children are now in integrated schools. We've got Model C schools. It's all wonderful and absolutely gorgeous. We're living in a rainbow nation country. Let's move on and forget about apartheid.
Yeah, there are parts of our society that are happily mixed. Some of our schools, like the Model C schools, you see young people who really don't see race, but that is sadly still the exception.
Mm-hmm.
For white people who come to me and say, why do you keep on returning to the past? Do you hate your own people? Why do you turn against your own people? Why don't we just all take hands and move into the future? I say you must be blind or insensitive or you're a racist. Because if you look around you and you do not see the legacy of apartheid and colonialism alive around you, it is there for everybody to see. The poverty, the lack of education, the huge discrepancies in terms of poverty and wealth along racial lines mostly. Those things are with us, and white people are in denial. And I'm generalizing because a whole lot of white people are not like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I'm talking to those who are. So white listeners should please not phone in and say I'm not like that. I know there are a lot of people like that. My friends are like that. They are very brave, very wonderful white people. But there's still sadly a whole lot of white people who live in complete denial, and it's not. It is not something that I want to forgive them for, because it is not real in their minds. They're dishonest. If they bother to drive outside of their comfortable neighborhood, they will drive past the squatter camp. They will see on the news the poverty. They will see what black kids in rural areas and in townships and squatter camps, how they go to school, and just compare that with your own children. Those battles have not been won. And I think we, white people, should be far more grateful for the peace and stability we have, and far more graceful about their own privilege.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, you see, a lot of young people now come to me, like AfriForum has just done recently.
Mm-hmm.
Saying, when is this affirmative action thing going to end? Because look at all the cases of people who couldn't get into universities, who couldn't get into jobs, and we were born after the 1990s, so we can't be held responsible for apartheid. We did not benefit from apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
If there are white people who did not benefit from apartheid, there must be a handful. Because I didn't have to. My child was born 7 years ago. She benefited from apartheid because I benefited from apartheid, and my father did. I have never been hungry one day in my life. I had a good education. I walked into a job. I walked into university. I walked into a job. I live a comfortable life.
Mm-hmm.
If I had been born in a squatter camp, in a township, or in some forgotten Bantustan of old, I would probably now be in jail or be dead, or I would be maybe a petrol attendant. And that is what white people should remind themselves of all the time. And I'm not trying to put a whole guilt trip on them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not great into guilt, because guilt can paralyze.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
People withdraw into their own heads. They go into sort of what is called internal exile, and that doesn't do us any good.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel guilty. You can say to me, I don't feel guilty because I never practiced apartheid. I never killed anybody. But then I say to you, but you don't have to feel guilty, but you feel responsible. Feel responsible on behalf of former generations, and your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather. Feel responsible to make a contribution, to make things right.
We're talking to columnist and author Max du Preez, joining us on the line, talking about racism in South Africa. We ask the question, are we winning the battle? Max du Preez says we must resist racism in all its forms, in all its various hues. Are we winning the battle with regards to racism in South Africa? Mohammed in Durban, good evening to you and welcome.
Good evening, ma'am. I salute Max du Preez, for standing up and talking what is correct and the truth. And yes, he is correct in what he says. However, I take exception to Max du Preez when he mentions of white people and black people. Now, the concept of white people and black people is something of the past. And wherever you travel in the world, I haven't heard anywhere or any part of the world there's white people or black people. Either you are light-skinned or either you're dark-skinned. And I think that should be part of our healing process. So at the end of the day, if we go with the spirit of being a South African, whoever lives in South Africa, yes, you belong to this country. Let's call us as South Africans. And I think that should be part of the healing process. Now, this all the time is white people, white people, white people. I think it just makes people sometimes superior as to white people are more superior than black. And if that terminology can come off our tongues, I think that should be part of our reconciliation, whereby we are as South Africans going forward. I shall hear Max's comment on radio. Okay,
Mohammed in Durban, thanks for the call. I want to talk about this particular one in terms of will using correct terminology heal the past prejudices, the past hatred, the past misinformation that we have regarding each other. Faisal in Mayfair, good evening to you and welcome.
Hi, good evening. Good evening, Mr. Jabba.
Good evening, Faisal.
Good evening, Max. Sorry, what I want to say is that, I admire Max and his forthrightness in trying to combat racism, especially color racism. But to me, in my opinion, is that racism, color racism, emanates from a far more deeper source, and to me, that source is religious racism. We often will talk about racism between black and white, but very seldom we discuss the racism that emanates from people who believe that they are superior to other people. For example, if a Christian says, I believe in Jesus as a savior, and those people who don't believe the same thing are going to hell, to me that's a form of racism. And we seem to tolerate that particular form of racism. For example, many Muslims also will say there's only one God, and those who believe, for example, Hindus or Buddhists are people that are morally corrupt and morally bad. That to me is another form of racism as well. And my problem moment is that while we seem to be combating the one form of racism in our country, we all seem to be very silent on the religious form of racism. And while we allow that form of racism to emanate and to flourish, I can't see how we're going to combat the other form of racism, which is color racism. I think we should all throw it into one big bag and combat it in all its forms as well, actually.
Faisal in Mayfair, thank you so much. I think you raise a very, very valid point, but can we throw everything into one pot? I'll ask Max how possible this is. But before we go there, let's take Usipho Stole in Johannesburg. Good evening to you, Ndade Stole.
Hi,
very well, thank you, sir.
Fine. First, let me say it's very refreshing to hear a white person in South Africa taking a very brave stance and addressing issues that some people would think to be very sensitive. But before I ask my question, I just want to disagree with Mohammed. I don't think that one should deny oneself. We are either black, white, whatever. That's given. That's how God created us. To say you don't see color, for me, it's like hiding behind the thumb. It's a question of how you behave towards other people that don't look like you. But it does not make you racist by saying others are white, others are black. But that's just how we are. That's how God created us.
Okay.
But then, lastly, it's a question I have for Mike. I was shocked last year when I went to one of the two primary schools, one in Parkhurst, one in Rosebank. I could count a few white kids, probably 2 or 3 that I saw during lunch break. And I wondered where have they gone to, and whether if them leaving the school just because blacks came to now attend these schools makes them racist or not. And that's the question I want. Because it worries me that when we try and integrate our society, other people run away. Does that make those parents racist, or is it something else?
Good one. Thank you so much, Ndades Tole. Let's quickly just deal with the issue that was raised by Mohammed in Durban, Mr. Dupree, the issue of white people and black people saying we should not be using such terms. Do you think it'll make a difference what we call each other?
I think it's not realistic, because we're not only talking about the tone of the skin, the lack of melanin, the darkness and the whiteness of your skin. We're talking history. I'm an Afrikaner. Which brings a whole heavy burden of history with me. My people, my ancestors were responsible for apartheid. They perfected racial discrimination from 1948 on. The Eugene de Koks and the P.W. Botha's were all Afrikaners. So that element is there too. A lot of South Africans are of British descent, and the British were the colonial power. And when we became a state in 1910, the British government decided that black people should not have the vote. So it's not only color, it's history. We're living with our history, and we shouldn't sugarcoat that. I do agree with a dream that one day we will talk about cultures rather than about skin color.
Faisal says, let's throw everything in one pot. There's a lot of religious racism that's taking place. We're not addressing that. And that sometimes is very much intertwined with the color racism.
Oh, yes. I think when we're talking about religious discrimination, we shouldn't call it racism. We should just call it prejudice and intolerance. And yeah, there certainly is a lot of senses of superiority among some religions. In our country, we possibly could say that Christians feel that their religion is superior. I, by the way, live where I'm standing and talking to you now. I live in the Boerkaap, which is also called the Malay Quarter. The vast majority of people here are Muslim. So I live with them on a daily basis with my neighbors and my friends here, and I hear them talk about how they feel that the majority of this country discriminate against them because they're Muslim. I hear the stories of some of the Muslim friends that I have who had to go to state schools where they were forced to pray to Jesus. So yes, there is that. We need to be far more tolerant and understanding about religious differences. Then I want to throw another thing in the pot, and that is gender discrimination, sexism. I think that is one of our big sins in our society, and all forms of our society, in all cultures, in all sectors. We're a very male-dominated society still. And we should get to a point where we say sexism is as bad as racism. If you discriminate against someone because she is female, or you discriminate against someone because he's black or colored or Indian or whatever, it is essentially, in terms of human behavior, it's the same thing.
Sebastolo talks about parents who take their children out of integrated schools or former Model C schools, white parents who take their children out. He says, is this a form of racism? Because we see a lot of this happening in schools around the country. Those who can afford, and most of the time it is those of a lighter hue, take their children to private schools where they are assured that a large majority of South Africans are being kept out because they cannot afford.
Yeah, I think one should talk about the individual cases, which I don't know, of course, but my suspicion is yes. It would possibly mostly be a racist motive. We should factor something else in here, perhaps, and that is fear and ignorance. I have met, after 1990, after 1994, before 1994, I was known as the big traitor and the big pariah and the big booty of black people and so on. And a lot of people hated me. And subsequently, I meet people in the streets and people come up to me and people email me and phone me and they've changed their minds. And then they tell me the horrific stories of what they believed in. And I say, well, that makes you a racist. That's horrible. And I said, well, we didn't know and we were afraid. We were afraid of the swart gevaar. So there is a big element of fear, and maybe that plays a role that somebody would say, I don't want my child to be in a school where there's a majority of black people because the culture is too different or because the standards are going to drop or something like that. And I think we need to sometimes be very intolerant of that, but sometimes we need to be a bit more patient and inform people and say, what are you afraid of? And this is, to me, the other important thing about racism. Racism is a form of an inferiority complex. You will not find a human being, you will not find a white South African or even an Afrikaner who's at peace with himself, who he is or she is as a person, with his past and his present, who is a racist. You look at a racist, you scratch a racist, and you find an insecure person with an inferiority complex.
KJ in Potchefstroom, good evening to you and welcome.
Thank you very much. Three very, very important issues. I want to salute Max. You are brave and you remain my hero. Secondly, I think Muhammad is out of sync, he's out of order. We will remain black and white, and there's nothing wrong to use that. Lastly, to answer your question, we are not making any progress with regard to fighting racism. Let me tell you, my dear, I'm going back to my little corner, and I remain black. I'm going back to socialize with my black friends, and I do not know any other race. That is reality. We are not making any progress. Thank you, my dear.
Thank you very, very much. That's KJ in Potchefstroom. What are your thoughts, Max, on those who say that we are seeing reverse racism in South Africa at the moment? It's being called justifiable racism, affirmative action, employment equity, all those broad-based black economic empowerment even. All these are forms of reverse racism.
Yeah, let me first say that there is no such a thing as justifiable racism. Racism is wrong, and it will remain wrong, whoever utters it or practices it. What I was pointing out in my column is sometimes when you perceive something as racist, like I used an example of an unemployed person with no prospects, poor, living in a squatter camp, and he has a placard and it has a racist slogan on it. I say, we should understand that. That does not come from a situation where this man is saying, I am black and I'm racially superior to whites. He's expressing anger and frustration about the position he finds himself in, and understandably, he blames it on history, on white domination, on colonialism and apartheid. I can understand that, but let's not talk about justifiable racism. Reverse racism, yes, of course there is reverse racism. I think Julius Malema made himself guilty of a whole lot of racist talk. You cannot, for instance, stand next to the president of the country on a public platform on national television and say all white South Africans are criminals. That is racist. You can never say all blacks or all Indians or all coloreds or all whites are this or that. That is the essence of racism. So if that's an example of reverse racism, yes, there is something like that.
Beautiful. Full stop to our discussion on racism in South Africa with Max du Preez, columnist and author.
The Talkshop.
That's a rebroadcast of a conversation that we had with author and columnist Max du Preez talking about racism in South Africa, saying that racism is dangerous and reprehensible regardless of any provocation. And looking at some of the SMSs that came in from you during this rebroadcast, one said, I won't mind to form a movement with Max du Preez. Another one said, congrats, Max. Racism amongst blacks, especially the connected versus the unconnected, it's hard to experience. This one coming in from Tony in Cape Town. And another SMS says, Max has many reactionary things to say about the ANC. Is this his way to win back kudos? Don't make yourself into a martyr. This one coming in from Tedzo, SMS from Tedzo saying, if you want to see racism in this day, visit Willow Moor, where white people treat blacks or coloreds as though they are stray animals. That is one coming in from Tedzo. And another SMS says, Max pronounces righteously that he lives in in the gentrified Boerkaap. Come off the grass, Max. That's as bad as pitching your tent in what's left of District 6. So those are the SMSs coming in from you, our listeners. Some pro what Max was saying, some not so much supporting his ideas of tackling racism in South Africa. Are we winning the battle? That was a question that we were asking with this particular interview.